Do you ever get fascinated by things you don't understand? I realized I've sat here through 3 services now and watched him play that, and I don't understand. Like watching his feet go only on touch and memory, and I'm partly fascinated because I don't understand, and I'm memorized at the skill. So thank you, Ken. Although I have to admit, I kept waiting for the power to go out. After the 9:30 service, when the power went out in the middle of that, it was like, all right, are we going to have it again? Interstellar. I'm going to start with our scripture today. It's from Proverbs, and it's the beginning of the 2nd chapter of Proverbs, and it says this: "My child, accept my words and store up my commands. Turn your ear towards wisdom and stretch your mind toward understanding. Call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding. Seek it like silver, search for it like a hidden treasure. Then you will understand the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. The Lord gives wisdom. From God's mouth comes knowledge and understanding." Discover the knowledge of God. I realized as I was playing with those words, I was actually kind of rewriting it in my head. I was putting it a different way, and in my mind I was thinking, discover the love of God. And from that discovery, wisdom will follow. And we know the love of God brings a wisdom to our life. I'm going to be pretty Methodist for a few minutes here and talk about our founder, John Wesley. John Wesley, founder of the Methodist movement, had a phrase. It's often repeated in Methodist circles. You don't hear it a whole lot outside Methodist circles. It's a phrase that said, "moving on to perfection." Wesley believed we were moving on to perfection. And you don't hear it a lot outside of Methodist circles. And actually, within Methodist circles, it can get avoided because this phrase perfection causes discomfort, I think. We don't like the idea of perfection. Culturally, our understanding, though, of perfection is quite different than what John Wesley was talking about. In our current context, when we use the word perfection, it typically means without flaws or without mistakes or without any imperfections. Perfection is the absence of faults. Very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. And we don't even use it in very nice ways. Have you ever thought of somebody or talked about somebody saying, "Oh, they're just a perfectionist"? How often is that said in an endearing kind of way? We don't usually say it that way. The perfectionist, it's almost a critical thing. And sometimes if we know that we're a perfectionist, we try to get over it. Perfectionism. Culturally, we don't like that word. It's kind of a bad word. Because how many of us are perfect? How many of us are without faults? How many of us are without flaws? None of us. And so this idea of moving on to perfection can seem a little odd and can cause some discomfort. It's hard to understand what John Wesley was talking about. But John Wesley's idea of perfection was very different. It wasn't without flaws. It wasn't flawless. It wasn't without faults. Wesley believed that our faith journeys are a journey towards what he called perfection, but what I would call an uninhibited relationship with God. Our faith journey moves us into this uninhibited relationship in which we bring all of ourselves, including our faults and our flaws and the things about ourselves that we like and dislike. We bring all of us uninhibited to God. And we fully embrace God's love given back to us. This uninhibited relationship with God allows us to know God's perfect love, to live into that love. Not only to understand it, but to embody it, to live out God's perfect love, to fulfill the commandment that we hear in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, to love God, to love neighbor, to love ourselves. Wesley described a person who has reached this perfection as having the mind of Christ and walking as Christ walked. It wasn't to try to strive to be without flaws. It was to live into God's love in a way that we put on the mind of Christ. Wesley reminded us that Jesus is our example of what perfection looks like in human form, what perfect love looks like in human form. I think that's a beautiful concept. And John Wesley believed we are all moving on to perfection. We have the capability to put on the mind of Christ. And he gets that from Jesus' own teachings. When Jesus teaches us, you can do what I've done and even greater, Jesus often said. Wesley believed that we're capable of this uninhibited relationship with God, to put on the mind of Christ and walk as Christ walked. Wesley had some great concepts, and man, I just yearn for some of his understanding of that. I love his questions, and then I get frustrated with them because he never gives answers. How do we move on to perfection? How do we reach that uninhibited relationship with God? He doesn't tell us. Which, if we're really honest about it, Jesus doesn't tell us either. Jesus is great with the questions and not as good with the answers. And I think it's powerful, actually, because it's not a cookie-cutter answer. It's not the same for everyone. It's something we have to figure out for ourselves. What does living into God's love look like for us? How do we move into an uninhibited relationship with God? This Wesley quote of moving on to perfection, this week as I was playing with it, I was reminded of something I read from Marcus Borg years ago. Marcus Borg was a theologian and Jesus scholar who passed away in the last couple of years. And in one of his books, he explained what I will call 3 levels of faith development. It wasn't quite his words. He sometimes got a little into scholarly words that I would get lost in, so I just reframe them in my own head. So here's my reframing of Borg's concept. His scholarly words were pre-critical naivete, critical thinking, and post-critical naivete. These 3 kind of stages of faith development. In my terms, as I reworded them, I simplified them, perhaps overly simplified them, into childhood, adolescence, and maturity. So pre-critical naivete, or childhood faith development, is that time when we take everything for granted. We absorb the stories. We hear the stories in Sunday school. We hear the stories from our parents. We take them all in. We don't really question them or think about them. We hear them. They become a part of us. We absorb the traditions, the stories of our faith, the stories of our family. They come in and we accept them. Sometimes we take them as fact. There isn't always a lot of thinking at this phase, but this phase is essential. It has to be the first starting place. How else do we question the stories if we don't hear them first? How else do we think about it if we haven't been told the stories of our faith and our families? And so then we've heard the stories and we've taken them in, and now we get to that adolescent phase, and this is that phase that I think of as teenage years. And I'll have to admit, I've talked about this before, but now I have a 13-year-old daughter, and it's a whole new, real thing to me. This adolescent, rebellious time. This stage where we resist what anyone in authority tells us. It's the rebellious teenager who wants to think for themselves, who pushes back against mom and dad, who wants to question and challenge and be different than what they've been told, where the institution, the authority figures all have it wrong, and we're going to figure out what's next. It's not the easiest stage for everyone, but it is, again, important. It's vital. You have to have this time where you question and wonder. It's that stage where we look up at the stars and we go, what? We wonder what's there, what else, what more, what's bigger. We begin to see the world from more than just our own perspective. We doubt, we come to our own conclusions. It's vital, it's important, it's healthy. And then Borg talks about the idea that you can get stuck in one of these first 2. And it's not a place you want to get stuck in either the first or the second, because there's this third stage. I called maturity, he calls post-critical naivete. It's the stage in our faith journey where we take what we've learned, all those things that we just absorbed, and we take all the questions and the resistance and the pushback that we had, and we find that they balance. And we figure out how to reconcile, and we bring our own singular world and we combine it with the world outside, and it's where the idea of science and religion can come together in balance, where we let go of an idea of black and white, either or, right or wrong thinking. We can find the gray. We can realize there's always a third option. It's that time where the world gets bigger, and we understand that our singular idea of God isn't complete. We need all of the understandings of God before we have this sense of God's love for the world. It's where the wisdom from ancient times and the wisdom from our time can join together and be harmonious. It's this beautiful place. And what I love about what Marcus Borg, when he talks about this idea, he doesn't talk about it in this linear sense that we start here and go to the second and go to the third, and once we've reached the third, hey, we're done. We don't have to do any more. That's great. It's actually this fluid movement in between. And if we get stuck, there's possibility to get unstuck. But the important part isn't necessarily that we always stay in this mature place. It's that we're always constantly in process. Because we're always learning new things, and we're always wondering, and we're always doubting. So we're moving through these stages, and that's when we find wisdom. It's not about knowing or understanding or being certain. It's about experiencing God's love, especially in the unknown. It's asking the questions. It's being open to new answers. It's figuring out who we are so that we can come to God uninhibited, so that we can absorb God's love and then embody it, so that we can put on the mind of Christ. Or as Wesley said, move on to perfection. What I love about Wesley's concept is that I think it's a concept that transcends time, moving on to perfection. And Borg's idea of being in process isn't something just static that's just for us. It's about God's ability to be present 2,000 years ago in our lives now, and who knows about the future. God transcending time. Which brings us back to the movie Interstellar. We're going to watch the same clip. We're going to watch the same clip because I think it's one of the most powerful movie clips I've seen in a long time. And I've actually watched it every day this week, preparing for the sermon, and I might continue to watch it for a while, because it's one of those poignant movie clips that you can interpret in many different ways. And I realized I kept putting God's love into the clip when she talks about love. And so you can bring your own stuff, obviously, to the movie. But as we move on to perfection, as Wesley calls it, as we go through faith development, as Borg talks about it, the constant that grounds us, even when we're unsure, is God's love. The constant that keeps us going is God's presence. So I invite you to listen again to the movie clip. Love is the one thing that transcends time and space. God's love is the one thing that, although we may not fully understand it, we can step out in faith. We can move on to perfection. We can continue in this journey with the assurance that God's love grounds us and sustains us. We don't have to fully understand God's love to embrace it. We don't have to fully understand God's grace to accept it. We don't have to fully understand God's presence with us to be a part of it. And when we do embrace God's love and we do accept God's grace, that's when we venture forward on our journey of faith towards this uninhibited relationship with God. And in that relationship, we find wisdom, we find patience, we find compassion, we find we can be empathetic to another's experience. We find God's perfect love. And when we find it, we realize it cannot be contained, it can't be boxed, it can't be stored up only for ourselves. We can't just hold on to it. When we have experienced God's love and we embody God's love, we can't help but offer it to others. We can't help but extend grace to others. We can't help but put on the mind of Christ and walk in his ways. It is life-changing, and it transcends all dimensions. God's perfect love transcends all dimensions of time and space and all the things we understand, and offers us this hope, this moving on to an uninhibited relationship with God.